Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. This is your host, Koku. I guess some of you guys may be overstuffed, sleepy, groggy, and the like. It's all good because I'm here again. And if you can't make it live, you can make it during the playback. It's all good. I hope you guys had a good day celebrating the massacre of the natives, or some of you foundational Black Americans call yourselves the Native Americans, right? Anyway, before I enter into today's show, let me just remind you guys of all the other shows on KWAZ Radio. Make sure to tune in to the Harsh Reality Podcast. If you have a business, they do the free business shout out. You can also DM them on Twitter to chop it up with them. Make sure I hit up Onita said the Pro Black Perspective. He's doing a lot of work behind the scenes that, if you have a desire to be free, you should link up with him and ask him how you can help. There's also the Queen's Council with Reese. The Queen's Council, I guess we'll see an episode soon. It's about that time. So keep your ears and eyes open for the Queen's Council. And then for me, this is the Bitter Medicine Podcast. By all means, please support the show in whichever way or whichever ways you can. The thing that we've been talking about a lot is the African-centered curriculum. By all means, ask me how you can join in, ask me how you can help, and I'll guide you, I'll direct you to where we're doing a lot of this work, where we're gathering the resources, where we're talking about it, and where we're going to start to really build this thing. We're doing this via a Discord server, so by all means, ask me how can you hop on. Lastly, this show is intended not to just be a show where a guy like myself comes on and talks to you or reads papers or what have you, but it's also intended to be somewhat of a movement as well, and we need soldiers to also help in this battle of getting the podcast out there, getting the work like the special project with the African-centered curriculum, getting that out there. And so I need hands. I need people who have no problem jumping on and working the buttons that I tend to work live on the show, but you guys work the buttons. And when you do that, what will happen is we'll be able to actually do some live shows where we have people calling in, and we could really have an interactive kind of program here. All right. So that's my little spiel for today. Once again, I want to give thanks to everyone who's here. What we're reading today is, let me just make sure my chat room is up. Okay. So, hello to Grand Pooba, who's in the chat room. Peace, brother or sister. Thanks for being here today. I know it's difficult for folks to kind of get themselves away from the festivities, however you want to, look at it, in terms of what you're celebrating. Some people look at it as a celebration of family. So I know it's a little difficult to get away from it, but I appreciate all of you who are in the chat room, all of you who are on the live stream. Let's get into the reading, shall we? Oh, Grand Pooba's a sister. Sorry, sis. No offense meant at all. I'm glad to have a sister here too, by the way. Grandpa, I don't know if you've been paying attention, but I've been doing a lot of episodes lately that have been, addressing the role of our African sisters in what it is we're trying to do as a community, where we're trying to go. And I hope you've been able to catch those because I've been speaking to folks like yourself, hopefully. All right? Okay. Story time. So today we're looking at this paper that's called African Solutions to African Problems, a Critical Appraisal by Zekeri Momoh. And I thought this was, again, you know me, I don't always read the entire paper before I come on. I like to kind of learn with you and put two and two together as we go along. But I thought that this title was just so appropriate. You hear it a lot in the conscious community, especially on KWAZ radio, amongst us who do these podcasts. Only to say chief amongst them, but you always hear us talk about the African solution to the African problems. And so I want to see, how does this paper, how does this paper, criticize or give appraisal to, the concept, right? As I'm looking for the paper now. Okay. So African Solutions to African Problems, a Critical Appraisal. Zekeri Momoh is the author. Let's read the abstract. The abstract, like I always tell you, will give us an idea of the paper in total. African economy in contemporary times is described as one that is highly dependent on the global north for its sustenance despite the enormous resources of the continent. This paper provides empirical evidence that African solutions remains better option to African problems. It employs the false paradigm model, which is a variant of the dependency theory. It also employs an analytical tool in its investigation. It argues that despite the experimentation of external approach or strategies to development, African economies have not made meaningful progress in terms of economic development. It suggests that African states must look inward how do they get these papers out with all the typos too? It suggests that African states must look inward for its developmental needs rather than on the global north. The Asian tigers, newly industrialized countries such as Malaysia, Singapore, and South Korea, among others, were at the same level of underdevelopment in the 60s, but have developed, leaving African countries behind. It further argues that African states must address the issue of corruption, political instability, poverty, bad governance, seat-tight leadership, bad governance, seat-tight leadership. That must be and tight leadership. And embark on critical economic and political reforms that are people-oriented, that will address the weak state of private sector in Africa, as well as good leadership style. Lastly, the paper argues that African states will not develop as long as they continue to depend on the global north for its developmental needs. African states will perpetually remain underdeveloped and indebted to the global north. This is gonna be a read. Okay. Let's just get comfortable then. Keywords: Africa, development, structural adjustment programs, global north, NEPAD. All right. Introduction. The African economy in contemporary times can be described as one that is highly dependent on the global north for its sustenance despite its enormous resources. Commodity prices have shaped its economic growth. Although the African continent, according to economists in 2015, is a home to a third of the planet's mineral resources, a tenth of the oil, and it produces 2/3 of the diamonds in the world. You know, it's tough to read that sometimes because, you know, for all these resources, I mean, look where we rank, right? The continent, look where it ranks. But look at its people. That's why you got to get organized. You have to get organized. That's the problem. Moreover, since the late 50s and 60s, when most African states had their independence from their respective colonial masters, they have been experimenting with different developmental frameworks aimed at addressing their developmental problems. Besides, there were developmental frameworks initiated and designed by the global north and international institutions such as the World Bank Group's International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Trade Organization, the WTO, to assist African states from their respective problems. Let me tell you something. By now, you guys should know this. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. When you hear these alphabet groups here, in fact, I'll wager anytime if you're an African and you hear about an alphabet group, run away. FBI, CIA, whatever, run away. It's a problem for you. The IMF, the WTO, you know, Africa, you know, if there wasn't so much corruption, right, where in African leaders, you know, basically they get paid or they make their bread off of selling out the people, right? And because of that, they will gladly sink these African countries, these African nations, right, with these alphabet groups. They'll gladly do it. And the thing with, you know, and it's becoming, or I should say, it's coming to a point where, like, the discussion or the mere mention of organizing, sad to say, is kind of becoming like an empty rhetoric, right? Like it's kind of becoming like, you know, like there's 0 calories to the term, right? It's something that we just say, but really, the emphasis needs to be put on the benefit or the benefits of being organized. Instead of saying like, okay, we need to organize, we need to be organized, we need to be organized, we need to be organized. We really need to start talking more about straight up what are the benefits, or just talk about the benefits, period, of being organized. And one of the benefits is that you won't be a slave. You won't be a slave to these alphabet groups. You won't be a slave to their loans, to their money. You won't be a slave, physically be a slave, you know, where African children are mining diamonds and all this old shit. Like, we gotta start talking about the benefits more than just saying, let's organize, right? We gotta start doing the work. Let's make 2021 the time to really start doing, you know, start creating the benefits, more so than just talking about getting organized. Let's start manifesting the benefits. Let's start doing the work to make the benefits be true. The policies include the accelerated development in sub-Saharan Africa, an agenda for action, also known as the Berg Report, that recommended structural adjustment program, SAP, for Africa by the World Bank in 1981. Other developmental frameworks include Africa's Priority Program for Economic Recovery and Development, APPER, in 1986, 1990, and later made into the United Nations Program for Africa's Economic Recovery and Development, UNPAIRD is what it's called, in 1986-1990, the Africa Alternative Framework to Structural Adjustment Program for Socioeconomic Recovery and Transformation, the African Charter for Popular, I mean, look at all this bullshit, right? This is when people want to look like they're doing something, but they're not. The United Nations New Agenda for the Development of Africa in the 1990s, the Conference on Security, Stability, Development, and you know what's so crazy, right? Like all those groups that are claiming that they're doing the work to uplift Africa, really and truly, where Africans, and again, when I say Africans, I mean those in the continent as well as outside of it, right? The thing is, we don't realize that these folks in these little, alphabet groups or whatever, they're not talking about us. They're just talking about the resources on the continent. They're not talking about, what's really going to help the people. They make it seem that way. And it's the same thing when we read the book, when we had the book club and we read the book called Napoleon's Ghost, right? What's that fellow named? Leopold, right? That's what Leopold was doing. Leopold was making it seem like Belgium was in Africa doing all this nice stuff and, helping the people out. But really, Belgium was fattening its own stomach, massacring the people there to do so. And so one of the things we got to really, when we talk about being organized, we got to know who are these groups. We have to create the groups. We have to know who's in them. We have to vet everyone. You need some form of checks and balances as well to make sure no one goes astray. But at the end of the day, the work has to be towards, creating benefits of being organized. Most organizing, especially when it comes from white folks in African nations, they organize for themselves. They organize for their pockets, for their countries, etc. They tell their people the benefit of what they're about to embark upon in the continent. But we sitting up here, just waiting to be entered, to be frank. And these guys are doing it with no lubrication whatsoever. In the chat room, Onita says facts. We just say organize. Yeah, we just say organize. But when people hear us say, organize, people nod their head and say, yeah, but what does that look like? And really, like I've been saying, what is really the benefit of it? Onita says reward and punishment paradigm. We need to explain the punishment for not organizing and the reward exactly. And only just added a great part to it. We need to explain the punishment for not organizing. That's the other side of the coin. I have been kind of tunnel vision as well in just talking about one side of that coin. Talk about the benefits, but we also need to talk about the punishment for not organizing. Furthermore, these developmental frameworks seek to achieve economic growth and development for African states. In addition, despite the initiation and implementation of these policy frameworks by African states, the question have been to what extent has these policy frameworks promote Africa's economic growth and development? Secondly, so let me highlight that there. The question has been to what extent has these policy frameworks promote Africa's economic growth and development? Secondly, does the solutions to African problem lies with Africans or the global north and the international financial institution? That is I hope he was being facetious with that question. That's a silly question. It is within the context that this paper argues that African solutions to African problems, by engaging previous policy frameworks on that basis, make inferences on the need for African states to look inward for their developmental need. Now we're talking. Right? The solution is always within. Before you go to another man, right, to solve your problem, you got to try solve it yourself. Before, if I'm like when I was in college and I'm doing like calculus 3 or something like that, before I go to a cal tutor, I gotta sit down and exhaust my energies on trying to figure out, on figuring out the problem for myself. And then maybe I'll go to another person for help. And so, the solution for Africa, like I've been saying for some weeks now, is that Africa awaits its creators and it awaits its creation. Right? We are African people. We have to fix it. And not go to Africa, like I've said in the past, trying to leech off of the continent like others have, right? But to go there in earnest and say, look, I can help with this thing. We could all fix this together. That's how you go. That's the only time we'll say reciprocity. It is against this background that this paper will provide empirical justification for African solutions to African problems. So part 2 is the theoretical framework. There are various theories that explain African solutions to African problems, such as the classical liberal economic theories of modernization, which emphasizes internal factors, and the dependency theory, which is an offshoot of the Marxist theory that emerged in the 1940s as a response and reaction to the problem of underdevelopment of the third world countries of Latin America, Asia, Pacific, and Africa. It emphasizes international factors in general and Africa's dependency on the dominant great powers to its developmental needs. Moreover, some of the leading proponents of the dependency theory, which has the false paradigm model as its variants, include Andre Gunder, whose work is strongly associated with the dependency theory. Other proponents include Raul Prebisch, Furtado, C. Dos Santos, Cardoso, F.H. Frank, A.G., F.H. Frank A.G., among others. However, this paper adopts the false paradigm model, which is a variant of the dependency theory that this paper is really written poorly, that owes its origin to the late 1960s, partly due to America's military involvement in Vietnam, the collapse of consensus politics due to the civil rights movement, as well as the moribund nature of social science. The emergence of what is today known as the New Leftists came as a result of progressive movement linked to the struggles of developing countries, including Africans, against the shackles of colonialism, imperialism, and neocolonialism. Besides, the false paradigm model posits that underdevelopment of Africa is attributed to the global north and their international financial allies, such as the World Bank's groups, International Monetary Fund, and World Trade Organization. Lack of understanding of Africa's problems and the premise of the problems inherent in their political system or economy make prescription for African states which do not share similar characteristics, both political, economic, and socio-cultural. However, International Monetary or IMF economist Kenneth Rogoff in 2003 posits that countries would be much worse off if they isolated themselves from the global economy. Perhaps poor nations won't need the IMF's specific macroeconomic expertise, but they will need something awfully similar. In the chat room or in the comment section, if you listen to the playback, do you think there's anything that a solid Africa would need from, I'm talking about Africa as a continent, as a powerful nation, would need from anyone else outside of her. Keep in mind what we read earlier in this paper about the resources in Africa. Is there anything that any country outside of Africa would have, would have that we don't have and that we would have to get from them? The false paradigm model posits that after the global north, countries through the World Bank's groups, IMF, WTO, had taken a myopic study of the African economy, will assume that they understand the problems and on that basis generalize or make inferences on the solutions to the problem. This explains the reasons for policy failure in Africa. Usually such generalization or conclusion by the IMF or the WTO has no basis, as each state in Africa has its peculiar problems. And so, you see this here? That each state has its own peculiar problems. That's one of the things I want people to understand too. Africa is a continent, right? It's 50 plus, somewhere around 54 countries are within Africa. Each country is dealing with, there's overlap, of course, but each country also has their own issues, right? Their own peculiar problems. If you prepare yourself outside of Africa, right? Because you live outside of Africa, but you prepare yourself to be able to tackle problems, right? To be a solutionary. Going back to Africa is not difficult because there's in just about every country, there's a need for solutionaries. Therefore, it will be wrong for any institution to assume that the problems inherent in the Africa with different culture, poverty level, and development indicators are same as developed countries, right? Consider your issue as an African unique, right? But when we remain so, American-centered or Euro-centered, we think that their problems are our problems. No, it's just a different set of problems. Thus, it is on the basis of assisting African states solving their problems that the World Bank Group's International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization encourage the training of Africans in global North countries through the World Bank's groups. Well, this guy likes to repeat this thing. The World Bank's groups, International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization, where the political and economic institutions have no bearing or relationship with African institutions. Moreover, these African trainees that have been trained by the World Bank's International Monetary Fund and World Trade Organization oversee and have been acquainted with high doses of alien concepts, principles, and theories, as well as developmental frameworks such as the Structural Adjustment Program, or SAP, that destroyed African economies, even Structural Adjustment Program for Socioeconomic Recovery and Transformation as relief, but did more damage to Africa economies the more. Wow, this must be a computer-generated translation. So let's see. So the Global North is suggesting that Africans be trained by the same groups. Let me see if I got this right. Yeah, they should be trained through the same groups that destroyed the continent, right? Or that helped destroy the continent post-colonial times, right? And folks thought that was a good idea, I guess. To even suggest that, some folks thought that was a good idea. It is against this background that the false paradigm model sees the African solutions to African challenges of poverty, inequality, underdevelopment, and insecurity challenges. It argues that wrong policies prescription is responsible for African problems. It calls for African solutions to African problems because the global North countries, through the World Bank's International Monetary Fund and World Trade Organization, do not understand the nature of African problems. Rather, Africans are the better option in providing solutions to their problems, as years of experimenting with foreign strategies or approaches have yielded little or no policy results, which are mainly negative or detrimental to African states. See, I have a episode of the podcast. Don't remember the title right now, but you can go back in the history. It's on YouTube as well as the, your favorite podcast app, Spotify, Apple, Apple Music or whatever. It's out there. And one of the things I talked about is like, you gotta identify your enemy. And clearly, the average African, home and abroad, hasn't identified their enemy. And it's crazy that that's the case because, listen, black folks, you guys, right, have some beef in the street with someone, y'all know exactly how to handle that other black person in the street. Example, Chicago. Right? You will lightly, have the back bumper on your car tapped by some black guy on the street and you're ready to kill that dude in another car. And that man is not even necessarily your enemy. It's an accident, right? Other ones of you actually have enemies because you're dealing in the foolish street bullshit where you're killing off each other back and forth, right? Because you've identified this black person as your enemy. But when it comes to these non-black folks, you ain't got no smoke for them. You don't take time and identify, these are your real enemies. I think about it all the time. It just passed a couple of weeks back too, I think. Yeah, a couple of weeks back it just passed by. There's this, not to pick on Jewish folks, but fuck it. There's this Jewish celebration, I can't remember the name of it right now, where they walk these far distances and they end up walking past this hood by where I work. And they're walking by and they're going, I'm talking maybe a 4-mile walk or something like that. They're walking through the hood like George Jefferson, hands swinging back, swinging their little Jewish body around, and they're heading through the hood. And these hood dudes are leaning up on these corners and watching them walk by, ain't saying nothing, ain't doing them nothing, right? But let me come through slipping, right? Let me come through slipping. They'll want to pull a gun on me. And it's because you think that every black person is your enemy. So we treat each other, or some of us treat others like we're the enemy. When these smiling, gringos will walk up in your place and the solutions that they're claiming, the quote unquote solutions that they're claiming to be giving you, man, are killing you for generations to come. If you understand who your enemy is, really, should the World Trade Organization, the IMF, should they be able to come and tell you anything and you think it's a good idea? You gotta identify your enemies. That's what they did in the Haitian Revolution. They identified their enemies, foreign, you know, and of their own people. You got to get your enemy up from around you as fast as possible. They have no good intentions for you. Therefore, the false paradigm model is adopted in this study because it was developed by theorists who understand the situation of their respective countries, developing countries, and on that basis, wanting to find solutions to their problems rather than relying on model being initiated or developed by global North countries through the World Bank's groups, International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Trade Organization, WTO. You know what? You guys do me a favor. Every time I read World Bank's groups, International Monetary Fund, every time I read that, take a drink of something strong for me, please. All right? For developmental assistance such as the PAD, which receive about $65 billion assistance annual from the global North. So now we have this section called the African problem. The NEPAD document affirms to the fact that the African continent has problems which it seeks to address. It rightly observes that, quote, in Africa, 340 million people, or half the population, lives on less than $1 per day. You know, this is where I should have had it queued up to play in the arms of an angel, right? But less than $1 per day. The mortality rate for children under 5 years of age is 140 per 1,000. And life expectancy at birth is only 54 years. Only 58% of the population has access to safe water. The rate of illiteracy for people over 15 is 41%. There are only 18 mainline telephones per 1,000 people in Africa, compared with 146 for the world as a whole and 567 for high-income countries. So these are some problems that you can immediately assign folks to fix it, right? Living off $1 a day, we can fix that through better economics, literacy. We could fix that through better curriculum, better outreach, right? Like, these are things we can fix, right? The mortality rates are tied to economics, usually, right? If you're in those, if you're in those areas, you're in medicine, you're in science, research, economics, like, there's a place for you in the continent to go and give to the community while also being uplifted by the community too. All these are clear indications that there are enormous problems facing the African continent. As early posited, the African continent is endowed with enormous resources, though not without challenges that pose significant threat to its economy. The African economy in recent time has been bedeviled with problems emanating from two interrelated sources, notably the problem imposed by the hostile international economic and political order within which African economies operate, and domestic weaknesses resulting from socioeconomic and political structures and neoliberal structural adjustment policies. It's funny to think that, like, powers that rely on you for sustenance can also, with the power that they derive from your resources, they could use that power to subjugate you even further. It's kind of wild to me. The thing, imagine you, I don't want to use that analogy, that's a little harsh, but imagine you paying, right, to go into an organization like the Scouts, right, of America. For some dude in the Scouts to be molesting you, and you're paying your money to go into this organization, right? That money in part is being used to pay this Scout leader, and this Scout leader is molesting you. It's pretty simple a thing to me that you gotta cut the lifeline of the people who are trying to dominate you or who are dominating you. If their lifeline comes from you and it's the source of how they can dominate you, it would seem obvious, cut the lifeline. Now, cutting that lifeline, you have to be ready for war. If I'm hungry and you were feeding me out the back door from your restaurant, and then one day you decide to close up that restaurant, I have nowhere else to get my food, me and you go fight. Even though it's your restaurant and you was giving me the food, we gonna have some words. That's what Africa needs to prepare itself for. You want to talk about being revolutionary, you want to talk about being organized and all this stuff, be prepared to war. These folks are not going to give, who cuts off the hand that feeds them, right? These folks ain't gonna let you just cut them off. You gotta be ready for the fight. Moreover, the major features of the hostile global order to include the integration of African economies into the global economy as exporters of primary commodities and importers of manufactured products, leading to balance of trade deficit. The second point has to do with the policies of privatization, liberalization, and deregulation, as well as unsound package of macroeconomic policies imposed through structural adjustment, conditionality of the World Bank groups and IMF. All these have been institutionalized within the WTO rules, agreements, and procedures which are unfavorable to African states. Besides these internal and external policies and structures by the World Bank groups and IMF, have combined to generate unsustainable and unjustifiable debt burden, which has crippled Africa's economies and undermined the capacity of African states to own their damn it, let me take a sip of water, developmental strategies, thereby making African states perpetually dependent and subservient to the global north. Also, the external impediments imposed on African states as a result of the hostile international economic and political order have exacerbated the internal structural imbalances of African economies, and with it, neoliberal structural adjustment policies, inequalities, socioeconomic and political structures have led to the disintegration of Africa's economies and increased social inequalities, as well as destruction of infant industries, agricultural production capacity, weaken the public services and the capacity of African states and governments to initiate and implement policies that will galvanize the desired balanced and equitable national development. That's a mouthful there. Damn. Thus, the cost associated with these has been disproportionate, marginalized, and subordinated groups in Africa, especially women, children, peasants, and small-scale producers. Y'all hold on 1 second. Yeah, I'm sorry about that, guys. However, the implication of the above problems on African economies has led to policies and programs reversal, dismantled state institutions that was put in place in Africa's independence to create and expand integrated production across African economies and sectors such as agriculture, industry, trade, among others. The CODESRIA-TWN-Africa report in 2002 2002 also posits that African programs and institutions which, despite their weaknesses, seek to address Africa's problems of weak internal market and fragmented production structures, as well as economic imbalances and social dislocation within and among African states inherited during colonial era, and to redress the inappropriate integration of Africa's economy's gains generate Africa's economy gains generated by African states during colonization of the continent have been destroyed. I usually don't do this, but you know, when you're writing, right? And again, this might be a translation of something that was written, you know, on the continent. But even still, you gotta make sure your translations are clear. You have to make sure your writing is clear, right? No cupcaking, man. A critical examination of the World Bank's groups, IMF, and WTO policies on Africa's economy shows I'm having a bad day, right? The pernicious act of these policies on African states that are caught in a debt trap, who have taken the bitter pills of the prescription given to them. The implications of the World Bank's groups, IMF and WTO drink again, policies on Africa's economies is that these institutions control the commanding heights of Africa's economy through multinational, transnational corporations, thereby making African states to lack total autonomy over their domestic policies. As their policies are externally initiated or packaged and closely monitored by World Bank's groups, IMF, and WTO. See, I don't know if you feel it, if you hear it, but there's a redundancy to this paper that, to me, you know, makes it a bit of a slog to go through. Because as you read it, and you guys in the chat tell me if I'm tripping or what have you, but to read it, it just sounds like, well, just get rid of these IMFs and WTOs and, you know, WBGs and just get rid of them. Right? Just get them off your back and let's strategize on how to, because, you know, there's ways to do things. Do you want a peaceful, you know, separation or one with war? So you have to decide, well, if it's so-called peaceful, then you have to come up with a strategy how to pay back these loans, which are highly oppressive. And truth be told, you can't pay back the loans. So that's even a foolishness on my part. You can't pay. So at the end of the day, man, just start to educate yourselves, right? Again, African-centered education would lead to, you know, your patriotic leadership, would lead to building strong relationships and community. And also it should lead to a stronger military. You know, one key component of curriculum, especially African-centered curriculum, is and should be self-defense. And so really, the only way I could see Africa out of these problems that this person keeps repeating, you just gotta tell them no and be ready to war. However, the policies adopted by post-colonial African leaders, as well as their practices in power, have denied African states any significant opportunities that will promote economic growth and development. For instance, the growth approach of post-colonial African leaders usually took the form of import substitution industrialization that is predicated on substituting domestically produced products for foreign imports and preserving foreign exchange. And that, you know, in what episode did we do? You know, we covered this in a few readings. King Leopold, King Leopold's Ghost, how Europe underdeveloped Africa. You know, several of those readings that we did talked about this very same thing, that like the textiles that Africans would make, right? These guys would do this thing that's described right here. Well, they'll just mass produce the same type of textiles in their home countries and just fill up the African market with this shit that was made elsewhere, thereby just neutralizing, just reducing the local, you know, industry of making certain textiles. This is what your enemy does. You know, earlier today, I heard someone mention the country Carthage. And it took me back, man, years ago to this history book I was reading, where, you know, back then I was even a more avid reader than now. And I remember like reading about these, you know, these wars in Carthage with Rome and stuff like that. And one of the things when I heard the mention of Carthage today that came to mind, that sprung out of my memory was, you know, when Rome defeated Carthage, right? You know, the Romans took water from the ocean or from the sea and mixed it in with the farm land to salt the earth, to make sure that they couldn't farm for years to come, for years after losing the war. This is what your enemy does. Your enemy kills anything. And this is why so many people talk about you can't really build in America. Because whatever you build, they'll destroy it. That's what they do. And let's be honest about something. If you are the controller of a nation, you wouldn't let a foreign entity, right, a population within your nation, you won't let them thrive more than your nationals. You just wouldn't. And so in some ways, to be honest, you know, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, based on their ideology. This approach to development hindered the total development of Africa's productive forces, as it has resulted to inefficient and unproductive as well as uncompetitive economies in Africa, which created the stunted private sectors that lack the capacity to drive the African economies. This position, however, is contestable, as there are indicators that import substitutions have contributed to economic growth in most post-colonial states in Africa. So, in some African, I'll be curious to know which African nation, But in some African nations, the claim is that the importing actually help the economic growth, right? But generally speaking, what these Europeans do is they take concepts from a nation, mass produce it, making it cheaper than the natives could make it. Therefore, it's cheaper, it's cheaper in terms of saleability. And so when people I'm from a place that has a tourist economy. And let's say you're a person selling conch shells, right? You go every day down by the wharf and you collect conch shells. You clean them up. Maybe you have to do some additional work besides just cleaning to kind of reconstruct and make sure that the shell looks, good enough for selling. Here comes the Chinese now with a warehouse, with machinery that can collect these conch shells, clean them up like nothing, maybe even paint them or something to make them, look more vibrant. And because they're able to do this in mass, and it's relatively cheap for them to produce a conch shell, they come there and they start selling, they set up their shop and they outsell you. And if you're running a nation, you shouldn't want some foreigner like a Chinese to come in there and be able to do some shit like that. So you have to think about that when you're talking about educating the future and nation building. You have to be very, very steadfast about not letting others take up residence, right? Taking up a place in your nation. Furthermore, the New Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD, document on Africa's historical legacies and poor living standards of many African states today shows that Africa's impoverishment is due to the legacy of colonialism, the Cold War, the workings of the international economic system, and the inadequacies of and shortcomings in the policies pursued by many countries in the post-independence era. The key to all of that right there, miseducation. In addition, aid programs to Africa are determined not on the basis of the recipient African states' needs, rather on the international donor agency's priorities and procedure. You see, of course, if these foreign groups are coming into your country talking about rendering aid, of course they're looking out for their needs. You're supposed to know that as soon as you see them coming. When I see new people coming around me, my first question to myself is, what the fuck does this person want? Wow, why is this person around me? Right? And so as African people, talking about nation building and whatnot, you're supposed to be looking at these people like, what is it that you want from me? And as a matter of fact, I already know it's too expensive. So no. Besides, foreign assistance goes side by side with practice, where foreign advice and expertise holds sway over product identification, design, management, advice of choice of technology, and influence of economic and social policy. I mean, basically, you're being controlled. You have no autonomy. You're being controlled. Also, Africa is the world's most aid-dependent and indebted continent. Why is that? Since the late 1960s, Africa has lost world trade estimate almost, oh my God, this is, since the late 1960s, Africa has lost world trade estimate almost, and US, Okay, so it's estimated about 70 billion annually due to inability of the African continent to diversify its economy. $70 billion annually. High debt and debt servicing have discouraged private investors and making African government lack the capacity to address its problems due to poor policies implementation, thereby making African states aid dependent. And this explains why African states depend on the global North countries for funding of the NEPAD projects and programs. On the whole, the failure in governance can be seen in African countries such as Morocco in February 2011 over demand for a new construction, Senegal in May 2011 over Presidents Abdoulaye Wade's attempt to amend the constitution and extend his time in office. Tunisia in January 2011 over lack of true reform. Egypt in February 2011 over reforms and justice. Sudan in late January and May 2011 against fuel price hikes. Guinea-Bissau in July 2011 demanding the resignation of Prime Minister Carlos Gomes Jr. Cameroon in February 2011 over President Paul Biya, 30 years in office. Malawi in July 2011 over economic mismanagement, human rights violation, and bad governance. Swaziland in April 2011 called for elections after 38 years, banning of political parties. All indications of strategic areas where most African states are failing. So, I mean, anytime an African state wants to show some autonomy and enact some policy or, you know, some type of development, economic development or what have you, you'll always notice there's a civil war that erupts. In fact, one's going on currently with Eritrea, I believe. You know, there's always a civil war that erupts, always some ousting of, you know, what the media, what the West will call a dictator or something like that. There's always this stuff, and who's really calling these shots? And that's the thing we got to really address when we talk about nation building on top of what is currently, you know, Africa. We got a lot of work to do to change the systems in the continent, right? And we got to be ready for, you know, reprisal. We got to be ready for those who want to protect, you know, their clenches on the continent. You know, it's a lot of work. And I'll tell you something I've grown up and learned to understand about human beings. Human beings don't like to face a lot of work now. And that's our biggest problem. We have to find a way to encourage and motivate our people to take on this burden. It's a burden. It's a task. It's going to take a lot of manpower. The idea that I hear some people talking about, like Tariq Nasheed, them talking about, I just need 300, bullshit. You need masses to really take care, to really do this work. And that's why we got to really start, you know, you'll hear people talking about codes and all this kind of stuff. But really, to me, the codes is in our knowledge. What we know from what we don't know. What we understand from what we don't understand, right? We got to start bringing our people up to speed in terms of what they know versus what they don't know. We need to know more than we don't, if you follow what I'm saying. The next session is African solutions to African problems. Let me pause here for a quick station ID.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
All right, we're back. If you're looking at the screen right now on YouTube, you see in the top left-hand corner, it has the email address for the podcast. If you have any questions or comments, you can email us. If you want to ask us how you can help with the projects that we're working on or the movement that we're trying to develop for this show, make sure you use the email up there. And if you want to text us, let's say you listened to this episode and you felt like I didn't discuss something or I didn't properly discuss something, by all means, don't call the number. Text me at that number, right? And I will definitely respond. And, if necessary, I'll definitely have you on the show if you want. If you just have general questions that you'd like me to answer or give my opinion on, by all means, hit me a text with a question or a prompt, and I'll discuss it on the next live show. So we're in the part called African Solutions to African Problems. Critical analysis of frameworks initiated by the World Bank's groups, International Monetary Fund, IMF, the World Trade Organization, WTO, you guys should be drunk by now, on Africa's economy have hitherto not transformed the African economy. Rather, it contributed to the increasing rate of poverty, inequality, and marginalization of Africans. Some of the strongest criticisms of Structural Adjustment Program, SAP, have related to their effect on sub-Saharan Africa. The decade of the 1980s, when over two-thirds of sub-Saharan African states were receiving World Bank and IMF structural adjustment loans, was generally considered to be a lost decade for Africa. I remember, I talked about this a couple episodes back, I remember this period well. And I remember my uncles talking about these loans, these IMF loans, and how bad it was for Africa. And this was in the mid-'80s, right? As it was during this period, economic growth per capita, incomes and investment declined, and unemployment increased. The impact of structural adjustment program was so severe, especially on sub-Saharan African states, such that in 1996, 14 of the 15 lowest ranked countries in terms of Human Development Index were in sub-Saharan Africa. In 1997, 19 of the 26 poorest countries in the world in terms of per capita GNP, or gross national product, were also in sub-Saharan Africa. For instance, in 2001, Ghana was forced to increase its water prices by 95%. By 95%. Wow. In Nigeria, the negative impact of the IMF and World Bank Group's policies was severely felt, and in January 2012, when the government of former President Goodluck Jonathan's administration partially removes the fuel subsidies on petroleum products, leaving thousands of Nigerians who traveled home for the Christmas and New Year holiday stranded, and eventually increasing the general price level or inflation. Potter, Benz, Elliott, and Smith in 2004 rightly observed that the impact of the Structural Adjustment Program on economic development is difficult, not least due to the far-reaching implications on the different elements of the package. They added that neither the World Bank nor the IMF themselves have been able to demonstrate a convincing connection in either direction between Structural Adjustment Program and economic growth. Also, Oxfam's campaign against IMF states that if the International Monetary Fund were a drug, it would have been taken off the shelves long ago, banned because of its damaging effects on children. The fact is, the fund stopped children going to school. Under IMF programs, many of the world's poorest countries have seen poverty rise and education spending fall, leaving children without school, a future, or a chance to escape poverty. If you find funds, policies hard to swallow, help us call for reform. The notion that black folks have, African folks have, that crying out for justice is going to save you, it is mind-blowing to me, actually. Right? The same folks who came into the continent, kidnapped its children, transported them viciously across an ocean to a new continent and forced them to do labor, to build a country. Right? This movement, this kidnapping of people funded and generated incomes and economies for all sorts of countries that were involved and all sorts of different European groups, right? These folks came into the continent, into the interior, and forced you to extract rubber from rubber trees, cut your hands off, killed you if they found you with a diamond in your pocket, right? And you think that just talking to them about changing the way they do business with you is going to change something? We have to get off of that, man. That's killing us. It's killing us. Faith in savages is killing us. Furthermore, another germane publication exposing the negative impacts of Structural Adjustment Program, SAP, was attributed to the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, in its 1987 report entitled Adjustment with a Human Face. The UNICEF report posits that the increased poverty and social polarization created under adjustment experiences and the nature of local coping strategies to adjustment that often meant overexploitation of natural resources. In addition, it also identifies the worsening states of women and children under 5 years and the reversals in human development that were currently occurring after a period of previous advancements in welfare. The implications of the Structural Adjustment Program on African states have been that it worsens the situation of vulnerable groups such as women and children. And I just want to say something about what I said a second ago. One of the problems with being in proximity with our enemies is that it's hard to convince our people that you're around an enemy. Because you work with these folks, and like I had to tell someone some years ago, the people at work who you deal with, I don't care what race or ethnicity, but people at work really interact with you to kill time. It just kind of makes the day go past a little bit better, and they kill some time. They get to study, you a little bit. It's like a game, like a puzzle, right? They study you a little bit, but we tend to look at the smiling faces, and they brought some potato salad with craisins in it. We thought, well, okay, it was cool. At least it was a nice thought. I don't understand the craisins and the shit, but it was a nice thought. And we think like, these folks are cool. But nah. Read their history. and see how they are with their own people. And then ask yourself, if they're that way with their own people, who am I? And it's high time now that the continent, the powers that be in the continent get this understanding. Because if you don't get the understanding, who suffers greatly? Like it said in the last line here, your women and your children suffer greatly. The vessel that brings forward your children and the children themselves, right? Who you expect to carry on, the nation in the future, they're the ones who are damaged the most. Although the new Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD, framework that have been described as an African-owned and African-led strategic framework for socio-economic transformation of the African continent, have to be criticized by this group here, KWAZ RIA-TWN-Africa Report 2002, that the goals may be well-intentioned, but the development vision and economic measures that it canvasses for the realization of the goal are flawed. The report further states that the NEPAD will not contribute to addressing the developmental problems confronting African states. Rather, the NEPAD framework will rather reinforce the hostile external environment and the internal weaknesses that constitute the major obstacles to African development. However, since 2001, when the NEPAD framework was introduced, it has hitherto not achieved its goals due to institutional and financial challenges. So far, are you guys getting a sense, those of you in the chat room, you getting a sense of where this author is going with the solution, for the African solution for these African problems? If so, put it in the chat. I'll read it out loud on air. Also, other flaws associated with the NEPAD framework has to do with reproduction of the core elements of the World Bank. Can Africa claim the 21st century and the ECA's Compact for African Recovery according to KWAZ RIA-TWN Africa Report 2002 include A, the neoliberal economic policy framework at the heart of the plan, and which repeats the structural adjustment policy packages of the preceding 2 decades and overlooks the disastrous effects of those policies. Well, of course, you won't do that. The fact that in spite of its proclaimed recognition of the central role of the African people to the plan, the African people have not played any part in the conception, design, and formulation of NEPAD. Notwithstanding its stated concerns for social and gender equity, it adopts the social and economic measures that have contributed to the marginalization of women. We talked about that. We talked about Africa, nation building and African women. That in spite of claims by African origins, its main targets are foreign donor, particularly the G8. This assertion was buttressed by Porter, Binns, Elliott, and Smith, that NEPAD is basically an appeal to the West's conscience for help, although the initial presentation of NEPAD to the G8 summit in June 2002 received a somewhat lukewarm response. Let me refamiliarize myself with the G8 countries and the G8 summit. So G8 refers to the group of 8 highly industrialized nations: France, Germany, Italy, the UK, Japan, the United States, Canada, and Russia. That's your enemies. Right? That's your enemies. Let me share that with you guys. That's your enemies. And you think that you're going to convince these folks to change, to do better so that you can do better. D, that in spite of claims by African origins, its main okay, so I read that. To the G8 summit in June. E, it underemphasizes the external conditions fundamental to Africa's developmental crisis and thereby does not promote any meaningful measure to manage and restrict the efforts of this environment on African developmental efforts. On the other hand, the Codes RIA TWN Africa Report 2002 argues that the engagement that African states seeks with the international financial institutions and processes such as the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, the United States, and the United States African Growth and Opportunity Act, the Cotonou Agreement, will further lock Africa's economies disadvantageously into this environment. And F, the means for mobilization of resources will further disintegration of African economies that have witnessed at the hands of structural adjustment and WTO rules. If you're in the chat room, do me a favor and copy the link to the episode how Europe underdeveloped Africa for me. I think a lot of folks need to really listen to that episode, if not read the book directly, of course, because, you know, all of this has been written about and documented, right? This didn't just happen, by the way, right? This is a long time phenomenon. However, Nyong'o posits that the Lagos Plan of Action, the LPA, initiated by African states were rejected by the Global North because they were generally hostile to arguments advanced by the advocates of the new international economic order. He further posits that the hostility and lack of support for the Lagos Plan of Action was demonstrated by the sponsorship for alternative assessment of African crisis under the leadership of Professor Elliot Berg report, which recommended structural adjustment program for Africa. The new the Lagos plan will be interesting to look up. Although the World Bank had argued that the Lagos Plan of Action was silent on issues of bad governance, corruption, mismanagement of public funds, the role of overblown bureaucracies, the parasitic nature of the African states, the World Bank therefore recommended that the first step to be taken by African states was to roll back the state, and secondly, to open up the economy to private sector participation. After several years of experimenting, the structural adjustment program recommended by the World Bank, African states that implemented the structural adjustment program became worse off. However, it can be argued that African bureaucracies are not overblown as it should be made productive through reforms that will enhance its efficiency and effectiveness in service delivery. Wow, this is okay. This is because Africa has one of the least populated bureaucracies in the world. Africa is one of the least populated bureaucracies in the world. Moreover, contrary to the World Bank recommendation of the Structural Adjustment Program for African states, Adedeji argues that if African leaders had shown commitment to carry out their own development agenda, the transformation of the African continent would have been actualized. I could get behind that. Nothing but a word right there. Right. Do for self. This idea a lot of scholars and Africans accept wholly because all the externally oriented developmental frameworks adopted by the African states have yielded little or no result. Rather, looking inward would have been the best option for African states. It is important at this point to ask this germane question. How long will African states continue to depend on the global north for its developmental strategy? The answer to this question is that African states are long overdue because the newly industrialized countries, NICs, also known as the Asian tigers, such as China, Malaysia, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, etc., were able to bridge the gap between them and the global north by looking inward, that developing an internally robust policies and strategies based on people-oriented or centered development, good governance, curbing corruption, and good leadership style that is lacking in most African countries. So, again, kind of a choppy read because it's choppily written. Question to you guys, either in the chat or who listen to the playback. Do you think these are the solutions, right? In comparison to what the Asian tigers, China, Malaysia, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, etc. Do you think these are the solutions? Are these the African solutions? Now, he just mentioned these Asian tigers, and then he says, well, this is what Africa should be doing, right? Are these the solutions? Now, we know from recent episodes and recent readings that one of the big problems with Africans is that we've gone away from that concept of Ubuntu. And my next episode is going to talk about Ubuntu a little bit deeper when it comes to curriculum building. But we know that we need to become, more people-centered, right? And then we build from the community. But are these other concepts, curbing corruption, good leadership? I mean, things like curbing corruption, good leadership, any nation needs that, right? So are these really African solutions? Or do they become African solutions when you enter the idea of Ubuntu, right? Where it's about people and community first. Is it that makes it this African solution? Write your comments below or in the chat room if you're with me live. The issue of corruption in Africa remains central to Africa's development. Momoh in 2015 have argued elsewhere that Africa annually lost $148 billion to corruption, which is around 25% of the continent's entire gross domestic product, or GDP. Within this US 148 billion, between 20 billion to about 40 billion, again in US, are lost due to payment to bribes to government officials in Africa. I won't get into it now, but this is what I talk about. You heard me talking about this like around election time in the US. Again, I'm not going to get into it, but the thing about being elected is that I don't care how poor they claim a country is, right? The thing about being elected is that you're in a position to make these deals, to take the bribes and make money, right? I'm from a small nation, but those guys, especially the guy who was, who became the first prime minister and stuff, those guys made their money because they were in the power position to make these deals. And again, I'm not going to get into it, but my point about voting here, back in my hometown, wherever it be, is that if I'm going to vote to give you power to make these kind of deals, to take these payments, these bribes, and all this kind of stuff that you're making money under the table, at the very least, for my vote, you should give me and my community something for the vote. And that's how I view voting. All right, you want to go make your money? Okay, man, go make your money, whatever. But two things should be true. For you to get the opportunity to get in there and do that shit through my vote, and my community's vote, you got to do something for the community. And when you make your deals, don't sell out the country wholesale. And this is the problem that we have in even in African satellite countries, right? Like the Caribbean and stuff like that. The leadership are making these deals. They're in power. They're making these deals, and they're selling out the people in the country wholesale in the process. And so this also speaks to what Onitase said earlier about you got to let people know about the punishment for not being organized. So when this leadership does this kind of stuff where they cutting their little deals and the side deals and all this kind of stuff, and you're selling out your country or your people in the process, there's supposed to be a punishment for that. And we need to have that kind of stuff articulated early on so that as the people grow up and get this African-centered education and become these patriotic leaders, they're reminded politely, if you go against us, if you go against the organized us, here's the punishment for doing it, right? If you don't continue this organization that we have going on amongst the people, here's the punishment for being disorganized, or for not organized. To continue, the implication of corruption on African states is that it has eroded the institutional capacity of African governments as procedures are disregarded, resources are siphoned, and public offices are bought and sold. Thus, corruption undermines the legitimacy of governments in Africa. Corruption also undermines being organized, right? If you listen to Onitase in one of the last episodes of the Pro-Black Perspective, that's something that he talked about, being a part of an organization and a guy who, the organization was propping up during an election run, kind of sold him out, And where's the organization? Is he still a part of the? Is he still a part of the organization? No. A special report by The Economist on aid to Africa titled "The $25 Billion Question" shows how international development donor agencies express their dissatisfaction in assisting African states. The report states that tale of corruption, grand, petty, sap the will of donor governments and the taxpayers who feel their generosity betrayed. The golden rule. The man with the gold makes the rule. Besides, corruption has further increased the debt profile of Africa's accumulated external debt, especially by sub-Saharan African countries, which rose from less than $6 billion US in 1970 to $80 billion US in 1985, and further increased to $230 billion in 1999. Also, considering the amount Africa lost to corruption annually, such amount can be used to address critical infrastructural problem facing the continent. For instance, Africa requires $21 billion US to transform its power infrastructure. Besides, Africa has lost 56 average days per year by manufacturers to power outages. It is also important to note that 25% of sub-Saharan African populations are without electricity access. Sub-Saharan African spent 27% amount of gross domestic product GDP on power generation. Africa has 93% hydropower potential unexploited, and 1.2 billion US dollars is the average yearly investment in power from public and private money since the mid 1990s. So I just want to go back to this one point here. Africa has 90% hydropower potential, 93%. And it will take 1.2 US dollars on average yearly to invest in it. $1.2 billion. You know, at the time of this papers, you know, inflation probably has it higher now. But what am I getting at? Are you telling me that's not a problem that Africa's creations and creators can't fix? Do you know how huge that would be for the continent? You got Akon out here working with the Chinese to do all this stuff, but you know, that debt is pending. They ain't doing it for free. They ain't doing it because they're nice people, right? You mean to tell me we can't solve that problem? We just need the right people. In achieving a robust regional integration in Africa, Quobo posits that African elites have been focusing on the wrong set of priorities with too little genuine commitment towards the goal of Africa's development. He further posits that for African states to achieve a successful regional integration, African leaders will have to move beyond grand gestures and abstract visions as African problems. Grand gestures and abstract visions as African problems call for pragmatism and a sense of urgency in action, as well as a more focused and gradual steps that are carefully executed at the domestic level may be the best place to start. And I agree. But you see, Africa's leadership, you got to remember something. We talked about this a couple episodes back as well. Africa's leadership also is beholden to African elites. Africa's elites have had a history of selling out Africans. And African leadership has to behold to its elites. Remember, how does a political party get to exist? It's funded. And it's usually funded by your elites. The elites of your nation. So that's like a double-edged sword of a problem. You got to change their focus. How do you change the focus of the elites? If you guys have thought about this before and have an idea, post it in the comment section. How do you change the focus of the African elite? Because if you change the focus, then the leadership will we'll probably still go along with the elite, but if the focus is in the right direction, then it can be helpful to the nation. Similarly, he added that such steps at the domestic level should be on bold and sustainable political and economic reforms. While at the regional level, the focus of African leaders should be on developmental coordination and gradual harmonization of policies and regulations, which could form the foundation for greater integration. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD report 2001 pointed out that even under a favorable external domestic trading and financial environment, considerable domestic policy efforts would be needed to ensure that economies gradually become self-reliant in sustaining rapid growth. However, Oijede in 2000 asserts that Africa Regional Integration Scheme should constitute an extension of domestic reforms to engineer them. Quobo, 2007, further buttresses Oyejide's assertion that it will require African states a strong governance culture and financial infrastructure that includes viable public service institutions, macroeconomic stability, and that African states should develop the capacity for competitive domestic economy through the development of private sector. He added that without credible infrastructure of governance supported by regular, free, and fair elections and respect for the rule of law, this is because it will be difficult to build confidence for economic growth and development. So, this talks about, again, the paper is about African solutions for African problems. But again, this is, and we're not done, so he might address it. But, we know that you got to change the way that African leadership, right, particularly the elites too, we know that they're problematic in the continent. We know that something has to be done about them. The question becomes, what and how do you do it? What should be done about them, and how do you go about doing it? Moreover, Africa will not be able to sustain its contemporary economic growth, which stood at 4.5% in 2015 and is expected to increase to 5% in 2016, close to the level it was before the 2008-2009 global economic crisis, after subdued expansion in 2013 at 3.5%, in 2014 at 3.9%. Without investment in its citizens, right? So the only way you're going to get, again, this goes back to the idea that you got to look at the people. You have to put the people first. Invest in the people, you'll get that return on the investment, right? But you also have to organize different areas within governance in these would-be nations, right? You have to make sure that everything is in sync, lock and step. Though, for this to be achieved, African states must conceive and own its strategic plan of development through Africa's cooperation that will increase in the volume of trade among African states by sharing of solutions and experts. And that's the thing too, it's something I notice. And I'm not saying it's just Black or just African folks, but we often don't really share ideas a lot, until a person is kind of forced to share their solution for a problem, like a problem occurred right in front of them, and they're like, oh yeah, well, maybe what you should do here is blah 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 blah. All right, but we should make it a practice, not debating, right, but sitting down after we've worked on problems and we've fixed them. We should really sit down and talk about what was the solution here. How did Tanzania deal with its electricity problem or its clean water problem? And let's see if that solution is feasible where we are. Apparently someone's preparing to race the Dukes of fucking Hazzard or something outside here. Right? As well as other forms of exchange, since most African states are faced with similar problems and can draw on positive examples from each other. That's a very key thing, and this is why Africa too has to, think about like allowing more folks to cross these borders, right? Nationally and internationally as well. More Africans, I mean, right? People who have ideas, who have experience in fixing certain problems. Let them come on over as teams and help you with your problem. However, political participation in most African states, such as South Africa, Mauritius, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Rwanda, Botswana, among others, have increased in recent years, thereby paving way for a more democratic consolidation as well as accountability in governance. Ake in 1996 posits that even at its best, liberal democracy is inimical to the idea of people having effective decision-making power. It's minimal. Okay. Therefore, he suggested that the type of democracy that is suited for Africa, rather than the kind that Africa needs, must take into consideration social and economic realities of Africa, such as Africa's social pluralism, its poverty, its relatively low level of literacy, and emphasize the rural community solidarity and cooperation that exists in Africa. So this is where the author, kind of states explicitly, the direction for solutions to these African problems. Ake in 1996 further suggested 4 essential features that the type of democracy that is suitable for Africa, rather than the kind that Africa needs, should have are a democracy in which people have some real decision-making power, over and above the formal consent of electoral choice, a social democracy that places emphasis on concrete political, social, and economic rights, as opposed to a liberal democracy that stresses abstract political rights, a democracy that puts as much emphasis on collective rights as it does on individual rights, and a democracy of incorporation. Okay, I like that. In addition, another issue that will require attention relates to the high rate of dependence of African states on external financing of their developmental projects and programs, such as NEPAD, can be overcome when the necessary efforts are taken to improve on the overall political and economic environment in Africa that will galvanize investment. According to the Economic Commission of Africa, the net developmental aid to Africa stood at $263 billion US. Let's just let the Duke of Hazzard finish. I can revving up his engine out here. However, even when the United Nations Resolution 2626 was adopted, in which the wealthy countries of the global north agreed in 1970 to allocate 7% of their gross national product as aid for the long-term development of the poorer countries of the global south, the global north has given 2.74 trillion in aid since 1970, which falls short of the promised assistance, which would now come to 3.66 trillion. Right? Lastly, as African states prepare for the post-2015 developmental agenda, at the global level and Agenda 2063 at the regional level, the preoccupation of African leaders at the global level must focus on the interests of the continent and how to promote political, economic reforms that will aid economic growth and development in the continent by moving from mere declarative statements to pragmatic steps that is problem solving, achievable, and goal-oriented. While at the continental, regional level, achieving the AU Agenda 2063 will be realizable if African leaders will have the political will to curb corruption, combat poverty, inequality, bad governance, political instability, and channel the needed resources to the productive sectors of the African economies, or else achieving the AU Agenda 2063 will only be a myth, but not a reality. Do you think this is feasible for those on the continent right now? We hit the conclusion. Before I finish the conclusion, let me take a station ID, a sip of water. I'll be right back.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
And I'm back. Remember to check out everything that's offered on the KWAZ Radio. Make sure to check out everything that's their support. Give them likes, give them subscribe, give them watch hours. It all helps us really, get the podcast network more visible, and that will allow us to have more actual podcasts on the network. The plan is to get some folks in West Africa doing a podcast on the network. West Africa, the Caribbean, the UK. We have Africans all over the place, and the idea would be to get them, those who are focused, on nation building, etc., right, to do shows on the network. So we're at the conclusion of this paper. I just want to thank everyone for hanging in there. I hope the paper is kind of dry, but I hope you got something out of it all the same. I thank you for taking time on a day like this to give me an air. Let's proceed with the conclusion. From the foregoing analysis, it has been argued that African solutions remain I'm not sure what is supposed to be to Africa's problems. It was also observed that African states have experimented various developmental strategies aid at promoting political and economic development of the continent. All of these policies have not yielded the desired chances needed by Africans. Worst of these policies is the Structural Adjustment Program, which has negatively affected Africa's economies by increasing the incidence of poverty, inequality, and underdevelopment. It was also argued in this paper that poor diagnosis of African problems by the global north, international financial institutions such as the World Bank Group, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Trade Organizations, which do not take into consideration the social and economic realities of Africa, such as Africa's social pluralism, its poverty, its relatively low level of literacy, and emphasizes the rural communities, solidarity, and cooperation that exists in Africa, have further worsened African problems. Our position in this study is that pragmatic approach by African leaders to the problems of the continent is required based on the fact that externally oriented approaches to development over the years have not benefited the continent. It recommended that African states should emulate the newly industrial countries or the global East part to development, who focuses on the internal impediments to their development rather than external factors by addressing the issue of corruption, bad governance, poverty, political instability, dependence, among others. By the way, some of the bad reading is not me. It's the way the paper is written. If you jump on YouTube and you read along on the screen, you'll see that the paper is really messed up in how it's written. Furthermore, it suggested that the preoccupation of African leaders at the global level, especially in this post-2015 developmental area of sustainable developmental goals, they must focus on issues that will promote the interests of the continent, especially on how to promote political and economic reforms that will aid economic growth and development in the continent by moving from mere declarative statements to pragmatic steps that is problem-solving, achievable, and goal-oriented. While at the continental regional level, achieving the AU Agenda 2063 will be realizable if African leaders will have the political will to curb corruption, combat poverty, inequality, dependence, debt, bad governance, political instability, and channel the needed resources to the productive sectors of the African economies, or else achieving the AU Agenda 2063 will only be a myth and not reality. So he's kind of reusing, wordings that he used before in this conclusion. But the question, really, how do you stop African leaders from not having the will to curb corruption? Is it just as simple as, well, pay them more? Is it just as simple as pay them more? Lastly, I believe it's a bit of both. I believe you have to pay them, and I believe they have to have been educated in how to conduct themselves and how to conduct the business of the nation. Lastly, it's important to note that the reason while the above-mentioned frameworks experimented by African states could not transform the African continent was that both at the level of formulation and implementation, it was faulty because African problems were not properly diagnosed before prescribing these frameworks. Secondly, the frameworks were faulty at the level of implementation due to political economy, incompatibility, as Africa and the global north has different political and economic characteristics. Thirdly, Modifications of the frameworks to suit African situations are difficult because these frameworks do not take into consideration the peculiarity of Africans' culture. This is what I'm talking about. Of Africans' culture, communal lifestyle, and solidarity. Right? Therefore, any framework that will address the problems of African states must, among other things, first be developed by Africans because they understand the nature of their problems. Secondly, it must take the peculiarity of African societies into consideration. Thirdly, it must be people-oriented or people-driven as well as welfare-oriented. Yeah, the guy's kind of repeating himself here. Lastly, its goals and objectives must be attainable and time-bound. For instance, the African Union 2063 is a right step in the right direction, but the fear is that if the set of African leaders today have the political will and resources to pursue the Agenda 2063, that will address the challenges of governance, resource utilization, instability, and further enhance regional integration of the continent. And that is the end of the paper. These are the references. If you want any of these papers that I've been reading, I have a Discord server where I upload these papers. Feel free to just ask me, how can I join up? Once you come on board, you'll have access to all of these papers. In case you want to be or are in the process of doing your own research, right, for your own presentations, for your own understanding of how to go forward. And you know, these papers, the more and more we read these papers, the more we see that it's fundamental. You know, the idea of community is fundamental. This is why when people tell you Pan-Africanism is dead, don't listen to that nonsense. Pan-Africanism is still alive and it's very necessary. It is extremely necessary. We got to start working in groups and communities better, right? And we got to look at our problems, not the problems of Europeans and their solutions, you know, socialism and all that type of stuff. We got to look at our own communalism, and that's the starting point. Second, we got to keep in mind that, you know, you have to educate the people to perform the way you want to perform. And third, and this is the one that you don't hear people talk about enough, we've got to become more self-determined, but also more able to self-defend. Remember, the only thing that comes before education is war. So education needs to be about war as well, you know? And so at this point, we should have the understanding of what the solutions to our problems are. It's not outside, folks, right? If they come with something that looks like a solution, that resembles a solution, if you inspect it quickly, you'll realize that the benefits are all for them, right? The benefits are not intended for you. So leave those quote-unquote solutions, these foreign solutions, leave them with the foreigners. The solution is simple. You and I need to work together. You and I, whoever you are as a black person, and we need to work together. Only thing I say is building. He has his project for his podcast. Ask him how can you work with him. Just that simple. We got to work together. We got to figure out, we have to look completely at our problems and create solutions specific to our problems. I want to thank you guys for tuning in. I know it was a difficult day to do this. Some of our people still do celebrate these foreign holidays. The paper was a little redundant. A little difficult to get through, but all the same, it reinforces some things that, we should understand by now. The next paper I talk about is going to be about the concept of Ubuntu again, but how it needs to be worked into curriculum. Remember, we still need soldiers to jump on board to help us work on and finish off this curriculum. By the way, curriculums are never really finished, right? But we need the manpower, the woman power. We need the thought. We need the expertise in different areas. So make sure ask me how to do it. Hop on board. Let's get this work done in 2021. Again, thanks for listening. I'll talk to you guys on Saturday. All right? Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.